The call lasted 15 minutes. Scott Peterson was standing somewhere in Modesto, California, on the evening of December 31st, 2002, while the people around him held candles and wept for his missing wife. The vigil had been organized by friends and family, the community's way of holding on to something while they waited for an answer that hadn't come yet. Laci Peterson had been gone for 7 days. She was 8 months pregnant. Nobody knew where she was. And Scott called Amber Frey and told her he was in Paris, not just in Paris, near the Eiffel Tower, with his friends Pasquale and Francois, celebrating New Year's Eve with the crowd, the fireworks, the celebration that was, in his words, unreal. The call was being recorded. Amber Frey had contacted the Modesto Police Department 5 days earlier, on December 30th, after she saw news coverage of a missing pregnant woman in Modesto and recognized the husband. The husband was Scott Peterson, the man she had been dating since late November, the man who had told her he was single, the man who had told her on December 9th, 15 days before Laci disappeared, that he had lost his wife and this would be his first Christmas alone. He had told her his wife was dead before his wife was dead. When Amber called the police tip line on December 30th and began telling the officer on the other end of the line what she knew, she said later that she felt like she was going 100 miles per hour. She was shaking so hard she could barely speak. She couldn't stop trembling. The officer was writing everything down. The Modesto Police Department gave Amber a recording device and told her to keep calling Scott, to keep taking his calls, to keep acting like she didn't know what she now knew. For nearly 2 months, she did exactly that. Over 300 calls would eventually be recorded. And Scott Peterson, who was being watched, searched, and surveilled by investigators who had identified him as a suspect within the first 48 hours of Laci's disappearance, kept calling his girlfriend and describing a life he was living in, parallel with the one the cameras were documenting. Paris, the Eiffel Tower, fireworks over the Seine, the candlelight vigil in Modesto where his name appeared on the program as Laci's husband. The same night. Laci Ann Rocha had grown up in Escalon, California, a small San Joaquin Valley town with a population of a few thousand people. She was the kind of person that everyone in her circle described the same way: warm, present, lit from the inside. She had studied horticulture at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo because she loved growing things, and that quality extended outward into the way she moved through the world. She cooked, she gardened, she hosted. She was 8 months pregnant with a boy she had already named, already set up a nursery for, already imagined into the specific future she was building with the specific care of someone who wanted that future very much. Friends and family remembered Scott as seeming ambivalent about becoming a father. Laci, they said, was overjoyed. She had studied horticulture at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. She had met Scott Peterson in 1995 at a restaurant where he was working. They dated, and then they married in 1997, and then they opened a restaurant together, and then Scott transitioned into fertilizer sales, and then Laci got pregnant with the boy they planned to name Connor. And then, on Christmas Eve 2002, she was gone. The morning of December 24th is a matter of record in some ways and contested in others. Scott told police he had last seen Laci at approximately 9:30 in the morning when he left the house to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. He said she was watching television and had planned to walk the dog and bake gingerbread cookies. He said everything was fine. He had not been planning to go fishing. He had told friends and family he was going to play golf that day. He changed his plans, he said, because of the weather. He had purchased the fishing boat only 15 days earlier, on December 9th. The same day he told Amber Frey that his wife had died. He had paid cash, $1,400. The boat had never been registered. At 10:15 in the morning, a neighbor found the family's dog, Mackenzie, wandering in the street with its leash still attached. Mackenzie had been let out, or had gotten out, and nobody had retrieved him. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Scott returned home and found Laci's car in the driveway and Laci not there. At 5:15, he called Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, to ask if Laci was at her house. She wasn't, At 5:45, Sharon's husband, Ron Gransky, called the Modesto Police Department to report Laci Peterson missing. Police arrived at the house and found it clean. Not unusually clean, just clean. No signs of struggle, no blood, no physical evidence of what might have happened. Laci's purse was there. Her wallet was there. Her phone was there. Everything that belongs to a person who is at home was at home. Everything that belongs to Laci Peterson, except Laci Peterson. Detective Al Bracchini arrived that first night and walked through the house with Scott. He noted things. He noted that Scott showed him the home with a quality of distance, not frantic, not devastated, just guided. He noted that when Bracchini mentioned search efforts, Scott asked him, unprompted, whether they had used cadaver dogs. Bracchini said he hadn't, and that he hadn't considered Laci dead yet. He was kind of surprised Scott asked that. In the days that followed, Scott Peterson became the central figure in his own investigation without ever being officially named a suspect. Investigators watched him. They searched his house, his truck, his boat. On the boat he had owned for 15 days and taken, he claimed, to the Berkeley Marina on Christmas Eve morning, they found something inside a pair of needle-nose pliers. A strand of hair. Forensic analysis confirmed it matched Laci Peterson. The K-9 unit that went to the boat ramp at the Berkeley Marina picked up her scent there, at the specific location Scott had described. The evidence was, at that point, almost entirely circumstantial. It pointed. It didn't prove. But then Amber Frey walked into a police station. When she came forward, the investigation changed its shape entirely. Not because Amber had witnessed anything, not because she had physical evidence, but because of a specific conversation that had taken place on December 9th, 2002, 2 weeks before Laci disappeared. On December 9th, the same day Scott bought the boat, he had told Amber that he had lost his wife, that she had died, that this would be his first Christmas without her. He had made himself a widower in a private conversation 2 weeks before Laci vanished, and the person he'd said it to had remembered every word. When investigators heard this, the timeline became something different. December 9th was not a date that previously had significance in the investigation. It was just a Tuesday. But if Scott had told his girlfriend his wife was dead on December 9th, then either the death he was describing had already happened, which was not the case, because Laci was alive and photographed on December 14th at a Christmas party with Scott. Or he had told Amber something about the future, something he hadn't done yet but already knew the shape of. And on December 9th, the same day he told Amber his wife was dead, Scott Peterson had paid $1,400 in cash for a fishing boat, a boat he had never registered, a boat he claimed to have taken to the Berkeley Marina on Christmas Eve morning. He paid cash because, one could argue, cash doesn't leave a trace in a joint bank account. He chose that particular marina on that particular morning in a location that would place him 40 miles from Modesto while his wife was last seen alive. The prosecution would later argue that December 9th was the day Scott Peterson began executing a plan. The defense would argue it was a coincidence. The jury heard both arguments and returned a verdict. The police gave Amber a recording device. She started returning Scott's calls. The recordings that followed are not dramatic in the way that television courtroom moments tend to be. There is no shouted confession. There is no moment where Scott breaks and says the thing he's been holding back. What there is instead is something more unsettling than that. A man who sounds completely normal. A man who is warm on the phone, who asks about Amber's daughter, who talks about the future, about travel, about what they might do together when things settle down, who calls her on New Year's Eve and describes Paris with the specific detail of someone who has been there, or someone who has prepared. Near the Eiffel Tower, the crowd is huge, fireworks, the celebration is unreal. 10 minutes before the call ended, a candlelight vigil for Laci Peterson began in Modesto, California. Scott Peterson was listed as her husband on the program. In January 2003, Amber confronted Scott directly in one of the recorded calls. She asked him what he had meant when he said he had lost his wife. She had told him that on December 9th, and now, all of a sudden, his wife was missing. Was he kidding her? Did he hear her? Scott said he did. He said he knew she deserved an explanation. He said he wanted to give her one. He said he couldn't. Not now. He said she didn't understand. She pushed harder. She told him she had told him December 9th. She told him the date. She wanted to know what exactly he meant by lost. Scott said, I did. I don't know what to say to you. He said you don't understand. He said he was destroyed. The media had been hunting him. He was destroyed. And the call continued, warm and ordinary and unresolved, the explanation never arriving, the conversation moving on to other things. The recordings were played in their entirety at trial. Jurors listened to more than 300 calls between a man and his girlfriend, recorded over 2 months, while a search for his missing wife was being conducted around him. What those recordings showed was not guilt in any single statement. They showed something more difficult to quantify, the texture of a man managing 2 realities simultaneously, and doing it with a quality of ease that, in the context of everything else, became one of the most damning things in the case. He never gave her the explanation. Investigators found no forensic evidence inside the Peterson home consistent with a murder having occurred there. No blood, no trace evidence of violence. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on behavior. On the affair, on December 9th, on the Eiffel Tower call, on the boat, on the hair in the pliers, on the K9 scent at the marina. On the way Scott Peterson conducted himself in the weeks after his wife disappeared. On the smiling, on the media interviews, on the quality of absence where grief should have been. On April 13, 2003, the remains of a male fetus washed ashore on the eastern side of San Francisco Bay, near Point Isabel. The following day, the body of a woman washed ashore nearby. Both were badly decomposed. DNA testing confirmed they were Laci Peterson and the boy who was to have been named Connor. They had come ashore within a few miles of where Scott Peterson had told police he went fishing on Christmas Eve morning. On April 18, 2003, the same day the bodies were formally identified, Scott Peterson was arrested near San Diego. He had driven south from Modesto. He was 2 miles from the Mexican border when law enforcement stopped him. In the car, nearly $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, a map of Mexico, his brother's driver's license, camping equipment, a change of clothes, weapons, a recently purchased golf club. His hair had been bleached, not dyed a natural color, bleached, gone several shades lighter in a way that changed the way he looked. His attorneys later said this was Scott hiding from the media. Investigators said it looked like a man preparing to disappear. The trial lasted 5 months. It began in June 2004 in San Mateo County, moved there because of the media saturation in Modesto. Scott Peterson's face had been on national television every week for over a year, and finding 12 people in Stanislaus County who could weigh the evidence without the weight of public opinion already attached to it was determined to be impossible. Amber Frey testified for 9 days. The recorded phone calls were played. The Eiffel Tower call was played. The December 9th conversation was described in detail for the jury. The navigation data from Scott's phone, the K9 evidence, the boat, the hair in the pliers, the bodies found near the fishing location, all of it was assembled into a picture that prosecutors said pointed in one direction. The defense argued it was all circumstantial, that affairs did not equal murder, that a fishing trip with a new, unregistered boat was unusual but not impossible, that the absence of physical evidence inside the home was itself a problem for the prosecution. If Laci was killed in that house, where was the forensic evidence of it? The defense pointed to a burglary that had occurred in the neighborhood around the time of Laci's disappearance, suggesting that someone else, not Scott, had encountered Laci that morning. One of the convicted burglars later testified that the break-in had taken place on December 26th, not December 24th. That testimony undermined the defense theory, but it remained part of the appeal arguments that Scott Peterson's supporters would make in the years that followed. On November 12, 2004, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on one count of first-degree murder for Laci and one count of second-degree murder for Connor. The second-degree charge reflected the jury's determination that the death of Connor, though caused by the same act, had not been separately premeditated. 11 days later, the same jury recommended the death penalty. Scott Peterson was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin State Prison. Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, stood at the podium during the victim impact statement and addressed her son-in-law directly. She said she used to think of Scott as a son. She said Laci had loved him completely, without reservation, in the way that Laci loved everyone she loved, fully and without armor. She said that Scott had known this about Laci, that he had known how much she trusted him, that he had used that trust. She said Laci had deserved better than what she received from the man she trusted with her life. The courtroom was very quiet when she finished speaking. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence, not the conviction, only the sentence, on the grounds that potential jurors who opposed the death penalty had been improperly excluded during jury selection. The case was sent back for a new penalty phase trial. Peterson was moved from death row to the general population. As of 2021, Peterson remained in California State Prison, pursuing ongoing appeals of his underlying conviction through the Los Angeles Innocence Project, which announced it would examine his case. The appeal arguments center on the jury selection issue, on the defense's claim that the December 26th burglary was not properly investigated, and on Peterson's claim that he was convicted by a media environment that had decided his guilt before the trial began. His supporters have argued that the conviction was built on circumstantial evidence and public outrage rather than forensic proof. Prosecutors have maintained in court filings that the evidence against him is overwhelming and that the jury heard it fully and returned the only reasonable verdict available. The broader question the case raised, and has continued to raise through every appeal, every documentary, every long-form investigation, is about the nature of behavioral evidence. Scott Peterson was convicted in large part because of how he behaved, because of the phone calls, because of the Paris lie at the candlelight vigil, because of the hair in the pliers and the scent at the marina, and the bodies that washed ashore near where he said he was fishing. Because of the moment he asked whether cadaver dogs had been used, on the first night his wife was missing, before anyone had suggested she might be dead. Each of these things, taken alone, has an explanation. Taken together, they formed a picture that 12 people found sufficient to convict. Whether that picture represents the truth is the question Scott Peterson has been asking in various forms from a California prison cell for over 20 years. Laci Peterson's mother still lives in California. She has spoken publicly about her daughter many times in the years since the trial. She has described a woman who was full of love and plans, and the particular kind of happiness that comes from knowing what you want and being in the middle of building it. She has described what it felt like to discover that the man who sat beside her at the press conferences and the vigils and the search operations was the man investigators believed had done this. She said Laci loved him completely. That was the fact at the center of all of it. Not the boat, not the phone calls, not the Eiffel Tower. The fact that a woman who was 8 months pregnant and preparing for Christmas and building a nursery and naming her son had loved the person sitting across from her at dinner without knowing what he was holding. And he had sat across from her and called her mother and gone to her vigil with a candle and given television interviews asking for her safe return and called Amber Frey from the parking lot while the crowd held their flames in the cold California night. Near the Eiffel Tower, he said, "The crowd is huge. The celebration is unreal." Scott Peterson asked Amber Frey on December 23, 2002, the day prosecutors believe he killed his wife, whether they should speak to a doctor about a vasectomy. He wanted to discuss it. He thought they should make an appointment. The following morning, he went to the Berkeley Marina. He said he'd been fishing. He came home at 4:30 in the afternoon, and Laci wasn't there. He called her mother to ask if Laci was at her house. 7 days later, he stood at a candlelight vigil in Modesto and called Amber Frey and described fireworks over the Eiffel Tower to a woman who was recording every word, in a room with a police device pressed to her ear, shaking so hard she could barely hold the phone. "The crowd is huge," he said. "The celebration is unreal.